We begin with what economists are calling a step in the right direction, but still a long way to go in Canada's affordability crunch. The country's inflation rate has slowed again, more than expected, to the lowest it's been in 11 months. But food prices are still rising at nearly double that pace, up 10.4% in January. The Bank of Canada has spent the last year rapidly hiking interest rates to bring down inflation. It recently said it was ready to press pause, as long as it's working. Peter Armstrong is CBC's senior business correspondent, and he joins us now from Toronto. So, Peter, overall, positive news, but still not the relief many Canadians are hoping for.
Yeah, David, it can be so hard to square what we see with how we feel, and even in some cases what we see with what we see. There's a ton of contradictions in this, as there should be. At inflection points, we're always going to see a ton of contradictions. So, as you say, the food prices are off the charts. 10.4% for food. If you bear down further on that, grocery costs are up 11%. That number's averaged out over, the grocery costs and restaurants. Meat is up 7.3%. Fresh vegetables up 14.7%. So people are feeling it. They're feeling it where they need it the most, where they can least avoid it. Shelter costs are up too. What's driving that? Well, interest rates. So we're kind of at the inception phase of covering inflation now, where the solution to inflation is higher interest rates, but now it's higher interest rates are driving up part of the percentage of inflation. All of that said, we are seeing real progress, and you can't discount it, right? We were at 8.1%. We came down to 7, then 6. We're now at a 5 handle. 5.9% inflation is definitely real progress. And if you dig down on the underlying numbers, the 3-month, the 6-month, the 9-month trends are all looking really good. The 9-month trend is dropping like a stone. And all the core measures that the Bank of Canada really likes to use, the median, the trim, and the ex-food and energy, all of those are averaging around 3.5%. So yes, we're seeing real progress, but it's really hard to convince somebody at home who just went out to the grocery store to buy food for their kids that things are any better, because it sure doesn't feel that way for a lot of people.
But do you think this data is going to convince the Bank of Canada, Peter? I mean, what are they likely thinking in the wake of these numbers? And do you think it can continue with the interest rates pause that a lot of people are hoping for?
I think in a weird way, this data falls better in line with the pause than, the jobs data that we saw recently that was, way better than expected. I think that caused some white knuckles down at the Bank of Canada. And even then, I think they can explain away some of what's happening there. But this deceleration is precisely what the Bank of Canada said was going to happen. It's precisely what the Bank of Canada wants to happen. And there's going to be an interesting point that, we're now comparing like to like, right? We're looking at how does inflation now compare to where it was a year ago? And we're no longer comparing it to where it was pre-inflation surge. We're now comparing it to right in the middle of
Okay, that was Peter Armstrong. We seem to have lost his connection there. That, of course, is Peter Armstrong, CBC's senior business correspondent. All right, let's hope this connection is a little bit better, because we want to dig deeper into today's numbers. And we're going to speak to Francis Donald, the global chief economist and strategist for Manulife Investment Management. We're hoping also that Jimmy John of Desjardins will join us. But Francis, while we've got you here, what's your take on these inflation numbers released today? Better than expected, but is this a sign that maybe rates can stay paused?
Well, look, I'm taking a step back and looking at what is really driving inflation for Canadians. Now, we're on the other side of a lot of the COVID distortions that raised the prices of renovations and cars and home fitness equipment. And now we're dealing with a whole new set of challenges. And one of them, as Peter rightfully pointed out, is food price inflation. Food inflation is contributing a third of the inflation that we're measuring in this CPI bucket. And here's the challenge. You're asking, well, what does this mean for the Bank of Canada? The Bank of Canada cannot directly impact most food prices, a little bit with restaurants, but what are we seeing? Eggs prices surging. Why? Unrelated to interest rates, there's an avian flu at play. We've got weather that's transmitting a lot of issues. Then we have energy that's driving inflation. We still have gas prices much higher than they were a year ago. Is that interest rate sensitive? Not in Canada. That's being driven by global events, geopolitical events at play too. So the Bank of Canada is staring at inflation that is still uncomfortably high, but can the Bank of Canada resolve a lot of the inflation that's still in the system? No, it's going to become increasingly difficult for them to tackle that segment that remains. That's the big challenge for Canadians and policymakers moving forward.
So what's the answer there, Francis? Is it just to ride it out? I mean, if jacking up interest rates, it's not going to get Russia out of Ukraine. It's not going to solve avian flu. It's not going to deal with the water pressures, and the droughts in the U.S. agricultural belt. What what option is available to deal with those factors?
Well, in my opinion, the first thing we need to do is not trying to think everything's a nail and just bashing a hammer on it. Interest rate policy is important and relevant to the inflation story. There are elements that are demand driven, but we need to have a serious conversation with ourselves as Canadians that a lot of what's happening to our economy is because of these external events. We're probably going to need more policy support that comes in and supports food in particular. This is going to really be very challenging for an extended period of time, particularly for lower income Canadians. They're going to need support there, just as we wait for other elements to fall. And, we're not all renovating our kitchen every month, and they certainly aren't things that we have to spend money on, but we are all buying food. A lot of us are putting gas in our vehicles. So the inflation that really hurts the most is the one that we're all feeling regularly and at the most common levels. It also, unfortunately, is the least interest rate sensitive. That's a really uncomfortable place for us to be in. I think step one is saying interest rates cannot resolve all of it. Let's look to some other areas.
Yeah, we're not renovating our kitchens every month, but we are using it every day, and it's getting more expensive to cook what we have in there. All right, Jimmy John, chief economist at Desjardins, has joined us now. So, Jimmy John, I wonder if we can get your overall take on today's inflation news and what this may mean for the Bank of Canada going forward.
Well, I see, some points of encouragement. I mean, 5.9%, that was better than expected. I was concerned when I saw the last reading in the U.S. that showed only a grind lower, and this one was kind of more decisive. And when we look at the short-term core measures at 3.5%, it means that the direction of travel is lower. So that's encouraging. I think the other thing that gives me also some optimism is that you have the share of components that are showing acceleration versus 3 months ago. That share has fallen to 39%. That's the lowest since 2020. So it's going in the right direction. It doesn't mean that there aren't points of concern, that inflation is not extremely high for food, for necessities. We're looking at rent, for example, 5.8%, still close to record. So it's not in 1 month that all those issues are going to be resolved, but we have to take the big picture. I mean, interest rate increases do hurt as well. So if we have inflation starting to cooperate, which I think is what the theme is, it leaves the Bank of Canada in a position to be comfortable in its pause. And it's one of the only major central banks to have enacted a pause so far.
Right, which I think is an encouraging sign for Canadians, because the two big concerns were that interest rates will keep rising to make life extremely unaffordable, and also that we might hit a recession. So I wonder, Jimmy, when you look at 150,000 jobs this month, retail spending up, yet inflation going down, I mean, how worried should Canadians be about the trajectory of the economy now? Could we get that soft landing that everyone was kind of hoping for?
It's still on the table, but I do think that when you look underneath those numbers, there's still some areas of weakness. Housing being one of them, a very significant one. We know that people are renewing at significantly higher interest rates, so that demands making sacrifices elsewhere. Right now, we're seeing retail numbers, spending numbers being kind of juiced up by vehicles in particular, because this is just simply prior sales that are being delivered. Once that effect fades away, I think we're going to see actual contractions in consumer spending, and that would spell a negative GDP outturns in the second and the third quarter of this year. I think that's going to be a necessary passage, if you will, but I don't expect this recession to be very long and very painful by historical standards.
Francis, do you still think the country is inevitably heading for a recession of some kind? Because when you look at the job numbers, you typically don't see that kind of growth in job numbers and historic low unemployment right before the economy contracts, right?
Well, nobody forecasts a recession lightly. It's an uncomfortable economic outcome. But problematically, almost every leading indicator we have that tells us where the economy is going to be in 6 to 12 months does flash red. Now, there are elements of the economy that are stronger, like consumers and jobs. But if you look at every major recession in modern economic history, unfortunately or fortunately, jobs are one of the last things to move, as is consumer spending. That's what we call a lagging economic indicator. In the United States, it looks even more problematic. That recession looks like it'll be deeper, but economists have a longstanding saying, when the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold. So once again, we're going to feel some of that impact from outside of the country. Unfortunately, that means we do have a recession in our outlook. I'm hoping, however, that job losses are more minimal, given we have a lot of labor scarcity. I see companies saying, you know what, things are bad, but we don't want to let go of jobs. That's the silver lining we can find here and hopefully mollify some of that impact.
So Francis Donald, Chrystia Freeland and the cabinet are deep into their budget planning right now, getting ready to deliver that next month or April. What would your recommendation be to her on going forward here? Would it be targeted supports for low-income Canadians to deal with these persistent high food prices, for example? What could they do to make things better without making inflation worse?
Well, certainly there's going to be ongoing calls to support weakness in the economy, but policymakers across the entire world are dealing with a challenge, which is that they have run up debts across every major developed market economy. Now they're heading into an environment that traditionally would call for counter-cyclical measures, that is, governments that spend more when we're in deeper problems. The United States is facing a debt limit. We've got all sorts of pressure saying don't spend more to inflate. This is as problematic for federal and provincial governments as it is for central bankers, this stagflation concept. What do you do when inflation high is growth is low? You're going to have to get very targeted, target specific groups that need it most, and really try to think about what's best for the economy by pushing aside some of those broader calls to restrain no matter what. I don't think that'll be the right policy as we go into a more difficult period.
Jimmy Jean, the same question to you, just as a final point. What do you think the finance minister should be looking to do in her upcoming budget?
Right. It's always going to be a very delicate balance to try to strike. I think at this point, though, given what we expect and what is consensus with regards to inflation, I would prefer them holding back and kind of wait and see how this economic outlook unfolds. Because there's going to be a point in time when it's actually going to be the right time to spend and the right time to invest, and particularly to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So I think now is the time to really reflect on those programs and deliver something that's more structural rather than just quick sugar rushes at this point.
Okay, Francis Donald, Jimmy Jean, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.